Hello and welcome to the Melbourne AWS user group number 104 on a day when we may be going back into lockdown soon, but let's stay positive. Who knows where this one's going to take us? There was one positive that came out of this though. We almost very nearly booked an in-person event for tonight. Very glad we decided that there was not enough notice for us to be able to pull that off. One bullet dodged. But on that note, though, obviously we are looking at planning in-person events again, and they may come back sometime soon. But we will obviously be paying very close attention to the Victorian government advice, and we'll see what comes out of the next few days and the next few weeks. But in the short term, we have an event to put on tonight, so let's get straight into it. So this is the introductions bit that I'm doing right now. Right up after this, we have our usual What's New in AWS segment hosted by Ian and friends. This month we're joined by JM. JM's back. Hooray. So we'll get onto that in a moment. Then we have Dawn, who will be talking about obscure security on Kubernetes. Dawn is a regular contributor here, and we always learn quite a bit from Dawn's presentations, so this will be a good one. And then right up after that, Ian will be back again, and he's taking us through how to do as little work as possible on your AWS patching, which is obviously something that we all enjoy spending so much time on. So hopefully there's some good tips coming out of this. At the end of that, we will wrap up, and then we have a post-stream Zoom catch-up as well if you want to join in on that. Details will be on Slack for that. If this is your first time watching one of our live streams or joining in one of our live streams, welcome along. We encourage you to ask questions of presenters as you normally would. We accept questions via Slack in the #Melbourne channel or in #Channel or any channel really. On Twitter using the AWS Melb hashtag, or right there in the chat on YouTube where you're watching from. At the end of the presentation, myself or Ian will jump on the stream with the presenter and we'll ask those questions on your behalf. So there's still definitely a way to get your questions answered to participate in the night. And we also welcome comments via the same 3 feedback channels, either about the night or just in general, or if you just want to talk about the subject being presented on. Like, it doesn't have to be a question. Just feel free to talk amongst yourselves as we go. And as usual, we would not be able to put these events on every month as we do, or indeed go back to in-person events, because catering is expensive, without our sponsors. And we're very grateful to our 4 main sponsors who have stuck around through last year, through the first and second lockdowns. And again, this year, they're still here and they're still supporting us. So a big thank you to them, particularly, or starting with our gold sponsor, Enabler, but also our 3 silver sponsors, AC3, CMD, and Do It International. So before we dive in any further, a little bit about who we are. My name is Rob, or you can find me at @Block on Slack. And my co-host, who you'll meet in just a moment, is Ian, who is at Ian. We don't work for AWS. None of our core volunteers work for AWS. This is an event or a community that's run by the community for the community. We're just people who use AWS in our day-to-day lives, either professionally or as a hobby, or whatever the case might be. Yeah, so we're not directly part of AWS. And the good thing about that is, of course, that we don't have to toe the company's marketing line. We're not drip-fed content to send to you. This is content that comes from your fellow community members. There is definitely plenty of AWS-sponsored content out there, and we promote those as well. We will have some of that on in just a moment. But yeah, so this is a space for the community by the community. Speaking of community, the best place to get in touch with that is on our Slack team. We have a fairly active Slack team compared to other AWS Slack teams that are around the world. At the moment, we have, where's the number? Almost 800 members on our Slack team, some of which who are active during the day, some in the evening, and there are some great channels if you want to get involved as well. It's a great place to ask questions if you're stuck on something, or to get some help. And we also have a few channels with some bots around focused on AWS outages and announcements if you want to join in on those discussions as well. They're always a busy place when we start losing AZs in regions. Very busy. But we also would like you to get involved. We're especially always looking for speakers. We always have a deficit of speakers. We never have enough speakers for these events, and we're always scrambling at the last minute. So if you have a topic you'd like to present on, or even if you would like to present or practice presenting, but you don't know what to talk about, jump in our volunteers channel on Slack and ask. We're more than happy to point you in the directions of some good talk topics, help you out to get there, and review your slides for you as well if you need that. Not looking for sponsors right now, but again, we are always looking for volunteers, especially if we're going back to in-person events. There's a lot of moving pieces to those, and the more hands that we can get to help out on those nights, the better, and the smoother it goes for everybody, and the better time everybody has. So again, there's volunteers channel on Slack for that. So on to some general news. We had our first annual general meeting. If you're not aware, we are we're backed by an incorporated association here in Victoria, and we have a very, very limited membership structure, but we do have a committee that is responsible for getting these events organized, making sure that we have sponsors, all of those sorts of things. Our first annual general meeting was held a couple of weeks ago, and you can see on this side here your committee going forward for 2021. Couple of changes. Ian is now going to be the president for this calendar year. Congratulations, Ian. You'll see him in a minute. I'm sticking around for a little bit longer as the vice president, and always sticking around as the secretary. And Matt Muriel is stepped up to be our treasurer for this year as well. So big thanks to everybody there. Another one that was on a few weeks ago, or last week, 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago. The AWS Summit was hosted again this year. By all reports, it was much better than last year. Whether you found the content new or not, though, I think it was a great reminder, I think, too, for a lot of people of stuff that was announced at reInvent that you maybe didn't get to watch. So that's always very good for that. But the videos for the summit are now available. You can find them by using that link just there, or you can just search AWS Summit in Google and hit go. So what else is on? There is a Melbourne SRE meetup tomorrow night. This is one of those meetups that, they go between the different cloud providers. This month they're talking, tomorrow night, yeah. This month they're talking about scaling your build up and down during COVID-19. Looks like it's going to be an interesting one if you're interested in those sorts of challenges. Check that one out at meetup.com/Melbourne SRE meetup. And I think that's all on my slides that I have. That's all that's happening that I can see. Yeah, cool. All right, so with that said, Ian, if you can share your screen for me, and we will get started.
Cool. Hello, without being muted. Always fun. And welcome back to our meetup. So as Rob already mentioned, today, right below me, you can see JM.
Hi, everyone.
JM. Yep. Cool. And let's dive into the news. As always, we will start with everybody's favorite part of Finally in Sydney, where we talk about all the things that have finally come to Sydney this month. Unfortunately, that list is empty.
We were lucky enough to have the summit, so there was some good stuff there. And like Rob said, this year was pretty good. Didn't have any problem streaming. I believe that AWS use their own product now. So that was good to see. Good videos.
Yep. But then let's just move on to actual stuff that we can talk about. On the serverless side, we've got Lambda extensions going GA. So this was announced, I think it was shortly before reInvent, as a preview, beta, whatever you want to call it. And it allows you to run something like a sidecar for your Lambda functions that can do extra monitoring and things like that. It is an interesting idea. I'm not sure personally if I'll use it much, but yeah. JM, have you played around with it? Or?
Didn't play around, but I had a deeper look on the product. Yes, you can have some extension API and then log API that you add to your Lambda functions with different connectors. The pricing doesn't change. It's still the same, but probably your function is going to run a longer time, so it could cost you a bit more. And for performance, that might impact as well, because this extension is going to run in the same memory and same CPU component of your Lambda function. So you might need to have a bigger function to run. So you have stuff like App Dynamics, Checkpoint for security, Dynatrace, New Relic, Splunk. I mean, all sorts of different plugins you can have if you have more regulated enterprise to analyze your Lambda function. So it can be useful for security and logging.
Yep. And I'd say the other big news here was CloudFront Functions. This is a bit like Lambda at Edge, but very, very limited. So you only have, I believe, 2 megabytes of memory and something like 50 kilobytes.
10K of package size, yeah. The big difference is Lambda Edge run in the regional edge cache, so there is only 13 of them in the world, where this CloudFront function run in the CloudFront Edge location, which there is more than 218 right now. One of the limitations, like Arjun said, is the memory size. It's just 2 megabytes and 10K, and JavaScript only. So that can be frustrating. So people who are more frequent to use Lambda. But the biggest advantage is much cheaper. And can run under 1 millisecond. So you don't have the 5-second trigger time from Lambda Edge and can run much more cost efficiently. So very useful to do redirection, HTTPS redirection, access authorization with JW token and header manipulation. You can use both, some cloud function and some cloud edge function as well. Lambda Edge, but you need to analyze exactly what you need to achieve with your manipulation of headers. But I think that's an exciting product. We're going to keep growing, I think.
Yeah. Cool. Let's move on to the container side of things. So I think the biggest thing here is probably the introduction of AppRunner. AppRunner is a new service that basically allows you to hook up your repo or ECR repositories and automatically spin up containers, do everything for you. Under the hood, it runs on Fargate, so it's all serverless. And in theory, you're not. This would mean that you don't have much to worry about. I haven't taken it through its basis yet, so I don't know how much the theory and practice are the same.
Yeah, it's a couple of limitations. The runtime is only Python 3 and Node.js 12. When you configure your repo, you need to attach GitHub and then have some authorization stuff to be able to publish that. And you can decide if every time you publish to master, you have your renew, or if you do it manually. It's kind of yet another way of running an app. You have Lightsail containers, you have Lambda containers, that you have that product. Quite interesting. He includes a load balancer, he auto-scale for you, he has HTTPS, so some good stuff there. Probably a competition from another cloud point of view in Azure and GCP, where they have similar product like that. It's available today in US East, US West, Tokyo and Ireland, yet to come in here in Sydney.
Yeah, just to clarify, Those language limitations that JM mentioned, they are only if you let AppRunner build your container for you.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
If you hook it up to your ECR repo, then obviously it's not an issue.
Yeah, that's already pretty on. Yes, correct. Yes. Cost is 6 cents per hour for vCPU, and then 0.07 cents per hour for gigabyte memory, and $1 per application per month. So yeah, pretty cheap, pretty simple to use. Need to see if the enterprise is going to use that, because that run at the moment into a Fargate public space and can't really talk to your VPC. So might be limited.
Yep. Cool. But let's move on to the next bit, which is DevOps. So we had a couple new services announced here. Incident Manager is one of them. This was taken apart by our always friendly Ian Mackay. If you are on the Slack, I'm sure you can find a link to his slightly negative post about it.
On Twitter, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can, do incident, do some response plan, escalation plan, contact list. Might be useful, and it's available in Sydney. So worth a try. Probably not as good as other commercial products, but it's a start. As always, AWS product MVP to start with.
Yep. The other new one here was DevOps Guru. This was announced at reInvent, and is one of those services where it seems like AWS really likes the word guru these days. And I am actually blanking exactly what it did, because DevOps is such a broad term.
You analyze your logs, your event, trace, and then try to put some AI on top and give you some advice about how you can run application with high availability, overutilization, memory leaks, and stuff like that. So it's to optimize your operational kind of component of an application that can be monitored. So it supports EC2, EKS, ECS, and CloudWatch Agent Container Insight as well. That you can plug into DevOps Go. Available in Sydney, I think, yes, as well.
Yep.
The other one, funny, CloudFormation Guard 2. It doesn't do only CloudFormation anymore. It does JSON and YAML, but it can do as well Kubernetes file, Terraform, JSON configuration, and stuff like that as a policy and code evaluation tool, to make sure that what you publish in your repo are properly formatted and secure with your governance on top.
Yep. And I know that at least some of the people in the chat are excited about the idea of version 2 of the CDK. I'm sure that Guy can maybe just in the chat post some comments about exactly what has improved there. I haven't looked at that part much myself. I personally am quite excited though about the Go functionality, as it means we can use a proper language to write things in.
So it's in preview right now, yes, and Go is supported now on all the different components of it. And the big change as well is one single package called AWS CDK lib. So all your library are into one package instead of having to download all the different one in little bits. So probably easier to use.
Yep. Let's have a quick look at the security part. JM, did you do anything yet with the?
Yeah, security. I'm excited about principal conditions. In the past, principal was principal, and you had to name it or not, or having a star. Now you can put a condition on principal. So that gives you much more granularity on your IAM policies, where, for example, you can have a bucket policy or allow all your users to access that bucket only through a VPC endpoint. But for CloudTrail, for example, which is a service outside your VPC, obviously, then you can allow that service. So your bucket policy doesn't apply to that service, for example, as a condition with a principal service name as CloudTrail. So you allow that service to access your S3 bucket without going through your endpoint. So much more granularity on your IAM with that principal condition can be, a principal AWS service or service name list as well. So you can allow a lot of stuff there, much more precisely with list privilege view for IAM.
Yeah.
In security as well, Audit Manager, 3 new framework: the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, AWS Foundation Security, and well-architected framework. So that's adding more framework to your Audit Manager. And AWS says, it's not because you have Audit Manager that you're going to pass your assessment, but they're going to help preparing your report and preparing the previews. So that product is available in Sydney as well. We're quite lucky to have that.
Let's have a look at the remaining items. Nimble Studio, which is basically a design studio. So it seems a bit like it gives you a workspace and a bunch of tooling around to build your movies or things like that.
Or animation, yes. It's got NVIDIA GPUs on it. So interesting product.
Yep. FinSpace seems a bit is similar, aimed at a specific part of the market, but this time at banks.
Yeah, banks trading application. They got stock market data in there. You can do analysis. You can build graph. You can do all sorts of things. It's around $50 a month per user, and available in the US at the moment. But really focused on stock market application. Yeah.
Yep. And I just want to highlight that you can now technically just randomly spin up instances that have up to 12 terabytes of memory. If you really need to host your WordPress site.
Yes, 448 CPUs and 112 terabytes of memory. That's a massive instance. But if you do, it's $109 US an hour. So make sure that you use your saving plan before you launch it, because it's around $100,000 a month Australian to run an instance like this.
Yeah. Now, I think that is what we'll leave it at for today. As always, we will be recording an episode of the podcast where we discuss all of the news. So if you're not familiar with it yet, subscribe to the podcast. I also keep mentioning my other podcast, In Without Sleep. Unfortunately, that hasn't had an update for a while, mostly because my daughter doesn't have any trouble sleeping, so I don't have to bore her by talking.
Lucky man. Yes.
Yep.
So yeah, the podcast, we will go much more in detail in this news, and we will go deeper in all the detail of the rest of the announcement.
Cool.
Please join us.
Yep. And with that, I'll hand it back to Rob.
Thank you very much, Ian and JM. I know Ian likes to remind everybody that his daughter sleeps very well, so I see he couldn't miss dropping one in just there. All right, so our next presenter needs no introduction if you were around last year. Dawn gave 2 great presentations on Control Tower and billing, and is now back for another one. Dawn works a bit more in security these days, so I'm very interested to hear the take on Kubernetes security and some of the tools that are available there. We'll switch over now.
Hello, everyone. It's been a while since I've been here, and I do appreciate that Rob has said that I need no introduction. I have indeed been working more on security lately, and so today I would like to take you through obscure security on Kubernetes. Do you have no idea what that means? Cool, because I also had absolutely no idea what that meant until I started delving into the world of Kubernetes security. So let me take you through it. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land I am presenting today. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. Their sovereignty was never ceded. So I'm not going to take Rob at his word in saying that I need no introduction. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dawn and I do a bit of everything, but at the moment it's chiefly DevOps and cloud security that I am working on. Just to illustrate the level of paranoia that's required to do a lot of this security work, I was not actually in the Facebook data breach that happened earlier this year because I have never had a Facebook account. Because as far as I'm concerned, they are a minefield of security problems. Outside of work, I am an occasional author and kitchen alchemist. I am also a raging sports ball fan. To that end, I have updated my speaker picture, so now, rather than being at Marvel Stadium, I'm wearing a hockey sweater instead. So you're setting up a Kubernetes cluster and you want to know what you need to know about Kubernetes security. And probably if you are doing that, you are going to take yourselves off to the internet and have a look at some articles about it. And what you'll find is a list of things typically that look something like this. Generally, the first cab off the rank will be external access restrictions, because when you set up your Kubernetes cluster out of the box, particularly if you're setting up a bare metal cluster on your own hardware or on EC2 instances, a lot of things like the API server and certain aspects of the underlying structure will be open to the internet by default. And so it will be suggested that the first thing you should probably do is turn that off. Then you have to look at, when you're actually getting to deploying workloads, how security works there. So when you're getting to deploying your first workloads, one of the very common recommendations that you will see is your pods all need security policies. And it's surprising how many people forget this, but in your average enterprise, that's going to be something that everyone very much does. Something that doesn't necessarily happen, though, is that with Kubernetes out of the box, all of the pods on your system have some degree of interoperability, so they have some degree of being able to talk to each other. If you want to restrict that, you need to set up a network policy, which will shut down cross-pod communication. Another very important thing is, in terms of the underlying structure of the Kubernetes cluster, your etc.d drive has a lot of really important information on it, and that by default is not encrypted. So you don't really want people sniffing all of the secrets around your cluster. So you probably want to encrypt that, and you probably want some sort of monitoring in place to make sure that nobody is making changes to it. In terms of secrets management, obviously you don't want to be storing your secrets in GitHub or storing them directly in whatever you're using to deploy workloads. So the recommendation then will be that you set up some sort of secrets management. You've got HashiCorp Vault, which is one that is very easy to install on a Kubernetes cluster and is open source. Alternatively, if you're in the AWS ecosystem, you can use the AWS Key Management Service as an alternative, and that will allow you to encrypt any secrets that you might need, but also things like certificates that you would use for mutual TLS traffic. In terms of authentication and authorization, there's really only one thing to say here, which is that you need some form of role-based access control. You don't want to be giving everyone an admin token to your cluster, and you don't want everyone to have exactly the same permissions, and you don't want to be manually assigning permissions per user. Fortunately, though, if you are using EKS, because EKS is backed by AEM roles, to some degree that role-based access control is built in. But Dawn, you say to me, this was a level 300 talk, so I already know a lot of these basic security things about Kubernetes. Why are you telling me all of this? Well, because there are a few common gotchas, and some of these common gotchas actually lead us to talking about the topic at hand. The obvious one, which is a bane in the life of any security person, is what happens when someone actually leaves your organization? Obviously, with AWS, this is not too difficult to manage if you're hooked up to SSO. But if you're doing anything bare metal in terms of role-based access control, you do actually have to have policies for what you're going to do when someone leaves the organization to make sure that their Kubernetes access actually gets revoked, particularly if the majority of your workloads are running there. And then you've got questions around things like, how are you doing access control for your secrets? Because if you're using something like HashiCorp Vault, you really don't want to be giving everyone in the organization a root token. You want to make sure that you actually know who is signing into the vault and who is changing things. Likewise for KMS, again, it's a little bit easier because a lot of that will be pre-configured, but you do want to make sure that you've actually shut down control over things. Then you sort of have to worry about not just the Kubernetes system data and etc.d and a lot of those other drives, but if you have data stores that are inherent to any of your Kubernetes workloads, what are you going to do to secure those? So do you need to encrypt them? How do you make sure that they're not accessible to the whole internet? How are you protecting against misconfigurations? And how often do you review your security posture? Now, these are the two really interesting ones in my view, because if you go away and look at a lot of the things that we talked about in the basics, a lot of that does require some degree of manual setup. So if every time you're creating a workload, you've got to make sure that the security policies are set up correctly, what happens if at one point someone fails to do that and something slips through code review and then suddenly you have a workload that's exposed to the internet? And this is where I introduce you to the concept of obscure security, which is also known as the things you probably won't find in the basic user manual. Those of you who saw the FinOps talk that I gave in August last year would probably remember our little friend, the hand-drawn bee, who is here to talk to you about buzzwords, because IT as an industry is a very buzzword-heavy industry, and like FinOps, security is also very buzzword-heavy, and a lot of these obscure security concepts on Kubernetes are very, very buzzword heavy, in that unless you've encountered them before, you're probably going to have no idea what I mean when I'm talking about things like service meshes. But that's why you sort of have these overviews to demystify some of those things. So let's break some of this down and look at it in terms of the obscure security user manual. The first thing that we want to look at is general security tools that in some way integrate with our Kubernetes cluster. And there are a couple of big ones here. The first one is application security testing, which breaks down to a whole lot of different things. You may have heard of the concepts of SAST and DAST before if you've ever done anything with security. That's static and dynamic application security testing. So effectively, a lot of static application security testing boils down to code scanning. Dynamic application security testing is more so black box testing. There's also, as a bit of an extension of DAST, there's also automated tools for pen testing. I'm not going to touch too much on those here for the main reason that a lot of them are not very easy to set up with Kubernetes out of the box. And there's probably better ways to do it. And that's not necessarily what an AppSec team will be dealing with anyway. You would generally have dedicated pen testers, not AppSec, not DevSecOps, but you would generally have dedicated pen testers that would be using a lot of those. But in terms of application security testing, that breaks down to artifact scanning, which for the purposes of containerized environments is usually going to be images, code scanning, which is fairly self-explanatory, and infrastructure as code scanning. So going away and looking at basically your underlying workloads, the underlying infrastructure as code that you've set up for your cluster or whatever else you're running, and to see whether that is secure. Then part 2 is tools that are specific to Kubernetes. And that is really three main things. The first one is cluster security scanning. So that's effectively tools that are going to go through and benchmark the state of your cluster against best practices. Then you've got things like runtime threat detection, which is trying to notify you before or at the same time as hackers are getting in. And then there's service meshes, the aforementioned buzzword, which are really an abstraction layer on top of the Kubernetes cluster itself that builds in a whole lot of stuff that is relevant to security, but also site reliability type work. So it basically builds in a layer of observability. It builds in a layer of security. It abstracts away some of the things that you would generally have to do manually or go away and configure yourself. So it's kind of like a control plane on top of the already existing Kubernetes control plane. So you're interested in obscure security and you want to actually deploy some of these things. Well, there are a few different ways to do it. You can deploy things using kubectl. You can set up your own Helm charts. But generally what I would be looking at in terms of a lot of these tools, if you want to get things up and running quickly, is that a lot of them actually have pre-existing Helm charts that are maintained for you by either the people who maintain these open source projects or by someone else who's taken it upon themselves to do that. And the really good thing about that is you don't have to put in the effort of making sure that everything works out of the box. Obviously, you will have to do some configuration that's specific to your own environment, which you can do using Helm values files, but you are not going to need to set everything up yourself. You can just often take what people have already produced and stick that on your cluster and you will be up and running. So I decided not to actually tempt the demo gods today because I feel like demoing multiple tools would be just asking for something to go wrong. There is a sort of companion workshop that goes with this. I am going to publish all of the sources for this, and I'll be giving the workshop probably in a couple of months at AWS Programming and Tools. If you want to see how a lot of this breaks down, that workshop will appear on my GitHub page at some point. One of the important things to note, though, particularly if you're working cross-provider or if you're working on a bare metal Kubernetes setup, is not every Kubernetes provider uses the same type of cluster management. And often those cluster management systems are very different. So EKS has its own, Azure, Google Cloud, Alibaba Cloud all have their own. And if you're setting up a bare metal cluster, there are several different options that you can use for cluster management. You can use Kops, you can use Rancher. I'm sure that there are others out there. The reason why this is important, though, is because in terms of actually keeping the cluster up to date, that will be important. But in terms of why I decided not to tempt the demo gods, some of these tools are actually very finicky. And some of these tools, if you have things like version mismatches between your Kubernetes version and your cluster management version, you can run into some pretty big issues, particularly if you're running bare metal. So do bear that in mind. But otherwise, let's have a look at some of these tools. For Docker image scanning, I'm going to look at generally open source tools that have Helm charts where possible. And the best option here is Claire. The aim being that you would scan container images using Claire for common security vulnerabilities. It uses a common repository of CVEs, but it does allow you to actually whitelist things if there are CVEs that you're not particularly concerned about, or if there are issues with your images, but they're set up in a particular way, you actually want certain things to be public facing, you can configure Claire to ignore those issues. Claire does have a public Helm chart, which is maintained by Wiremind. So it is very much a one-click deployment, and then you will have it up and running on your system. And it's something where you can integrate it into your pipeline. So before you deploy an image or immediately after an image is built, you can run Claire on it to make sure that there are no vulnerabilities there. And if it returns failures, you can actually stop the pipeline. Code scanning is probably one that just about everyone who's ever worked in an enterprise has actually heard of. And there are 1,000,001 solutions for this that require you to fork over large amounts of money. But the open source option, hands down, is SonarQube. Because not only does it perform code quality checks, it also scans your code for common application security issues, and it has the best language coverage of any options out there. It does also have some third-party plugins for less common languages. Use at your own risk. Don't ask how I know this, considering that I work at an organization now that uses a very niche language for very specific use cases. But do tread at your own risk if you're using the third-party plugins. And SonarQube also has a public Helm chart, which is maintained by Atimo. So again, it's a thing of you can spin it up, you can enforce use of SonarQube in your pipelines, and you can just have the SonarQube instance quietly running on Kubernetes in the background. And then there's infrastructure as code scanning, which is a bit of an interesting one because there are multiple options for this, including a couple that AWS suggests. And SNCC has a paid option, but in terms of open source options that you could install on your Kubernetes instance, Chekhov is hands down the best for the simple reason that it doesn't just support Terraform, it also supports CloudFormation and basically all Kubernetes configuration files by default. Now, this one doesn't have a publicly maintained sort of official supported Helm chart. There are some Helm charts out there that people have set up themselves, but it will be a local install by default. The other thing that you can do with it is for a lot of the pipelining tools, if you're running something like Jenkins on your Kubernetes instance, you can actually just whack it into Jenkins. And so what Chekhov will do is, again, it's checking your infrastructure as code against baseline rules. It allows you some degree of customization, so you can actually go, I want to make sure that we're not spinning up any of this type of resource, or I want to verify that these resources look the way that I would expect them to. And it's also looking for common security misconfigurations. As part of that, it does actually provide you with an overview of the way that all of your resources fit together. So you can then go back and look at that as well. And if you find that there are connections that you think shouldn't be there, it provides a very good starting point to actually go away and look at how the whole system is set up. So that's it for the tools that are not Kubernetes specific. But in terms of stuff that is Kubernetes specific, the first thing then to look at here is cluster scanning. So KubeBench is the tool that I'm going to recommend for this. And Aqua Security, who produce KubeBench, have an absolutely fantastic suite of other Kubernetes tools, many of which I wish I could have managed to get into this talk. But KubeBench is one of the simplest tools that they sort of have, and it does its job really well. It will run a static check against your Kubernetes cluster, against the Center for Internet Security's Kubernetes benchmarks, and it will give you back a report, which is pass or fail. You can run it against only specific sections of the benchmark, which is very useful, particularly if you're trying to remediate issues as you go. Now, KubeBench can be installed on the Kubernetes host. There's no Helm chart out of the box, but there are instructions on the GitHub repository, which will be in the sources, which I'll finish reviewing and publishing later. There are instructions there for setting it up in a container that you can just deploy to Kubernetes. Then we get into the fun things, the more buzzwordy things, and the first one of those is runtime security. Probably the most common runtime security tool that people here would be familiar with is AWS Guard Duty. But the one that we're concerned with here, which is again an open source tool, and this one is actually backed by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, is Falco. So effectively what this does as a runtime security tool is a couple of things. The first one is that you can actually tell it, I want only particular types of resources to be deployed to my cluster. Everything that goes onto my cluster, I want to meet these particular security rules. And if whatever you're deploying doesn't meet those security rules, then it will go and ping you on Slack or PagerDuty or OpsGenie or VictorOps or whatever sort of SRE tool you're using. So you can then go and wake up the poor people who are monitoring your Kubernetes cluster and tell them to go and fix the deployment that someone else pushed at 2 o'clock in the morning. The other really cool thing that Falco does, which is probably a bit more relevant to the type of work that GuardDuty does, is it will actually detect potential threats or potential malicious activity in real time. So if someone is trying to crack the admin password to your cluster, or if there's, a login from somewhere in Europe when your company is based in Australia, Falco will actually detect that. And again, whichever poor sod is on the other end of the pager will get woken up to deal with it. And the thing that's really good about Falco is it integrates with a lot of those common observability tools by default. So if you want to send Falco's observations to Prometheus, or if you want to send Falco's observations directly to whatever you're using as a pager tool, you can do that really easily. Obviously, with this one, there's some degree of configuration required to actually get it to work. But if you're looking for something that's like GuardDuty for Kubernetes, or that has some of the same features as GuardDuty for Kubernetes, this is where you'd want to go. And then finally, there's the service mesh, which is the truly buzzwordiest bit of all of this obscure security. And the one that's very common is Istio. It's the one that's been around for the longest. It's the one that's the most supported and the most in use. And basically what service meshes do, this is kind of a simplified description of it, but it's basically adding a layer of abstraction on top of the bare metal of your AWS cluster. So by default, it installs certain security tools for you. It installs certain observability tools for you. It will actually manage some of the interfaces between different Kubernetes services that you would usually need to manage yourself. And so if you use it properly, which is a big if, service meshes can be great to reduce some of that misconfiguration. One thing that's important to note for people who regularly work across different types of clouds is Google actually has an officially supported version of this, and they very specifically say, don't install other service meshes, use the supported version, because they can't guarantee what will potentially go wrong with other service meshes. So if you do happen to be running a GKE workload, I know this is an AWS meetup, but just be aware of that, because that is a huge gotcha if you want to install a service mesh. And as with a lot of these tools, Istio does actually maintain a public Helm chart for this. So if you want to install it onto your cluster, it's really easy to do. But Dawn, I hear you saying this time, there aren't enough hours in the day for all of our engineers to go away and install all of these tools. And I actually absolutely agree with you on that one, because there are a dizzying array of Kubernetes tools out there. And as with everything else in IT, it's really about understanding what the right tool for the job is. I do think, though, and a lot of common security recommendations will back me up, that everyone should use, if you're running a Kubernetes workload, hell, if you're running any containerized workload, you should be using some sort of image scanner, because it's really easy for misconfigurations to slip through a lot of those types of container images that you would use. And everyone who's running a Kubernetes scanner, a Kubernetes cluster, in my view, should be running a cluster scanner on a semi-regular basis to make sure that you're picking up any major misconfigurations that you have. As far as a lot of the other tools, though, I think that most application security scanning tools have their place, but the real bang for your buck there is large companies. Because large companies with lots of devs, particularly if your security team is underfunded, as they generally seem to be, it's going to be very difficult for you to be across all of the potential security vulnerabilities in a really big code base. So if you can actually enforce every time you're running a CI pipeline that there have to be particular static application security tools running, you should absolutely do that. I also think that there are a lot of good use cases, particularly for the infrastructure as code scanning. If you are doing things like running Kubernetes clusters, if you've got the engineering time and the engineering capacity, it's probably also a good thing to have some sort of infrastructure as code scanning. Because the thing you have to remember, particularly if you're not using CloudFormation, is there are some different attack vectors that if you've been very locked into the AWS ecosystem, you might not be used to. And a lot of those infrastructure as code scanning tools will actually surface that for you. The runtime security tools, things like Falco, are great, but in my view, they're a nice to have. I think it's fantastic to be able to get all of that stuff automated into one place. But at the same time, there are potentially a lot of other things that you can do with your time that are going to be much more impactful. So if you have the time to set it up properly, great, absolutely go and do it, but make sure that you've got all of the basics nailed down first. The service meshes, however, in my view, are quite situational. They give you a lot of really good resources, but they add a layer of complexity on top of the default sort of container management and control plane of Kubernetes. So they're probably better suited for if you have very complex workloads or very sprawling workloads running on Kubernetes. Definitely research that before you commit your time and resources to it. There are also out on the internet a lot of other obscure security sources. I did reference when I was talking about Kubebench the entire suite of Aqua security products. They have a lot of really, really good stuff there that at some point I want to just spend a weekend installing it all on a cluster and seeing what it does. But if you have a Kubernetes security related problem, they've probably got a tool that at least partially solves it. The other thing that's really cool about Kubernetes and Helm charts is, like there are public repositories for Docker images, there are actually public repositories for workloads that are commonly run on Kubernetes, in particular Artifact Hub. And when I was initially looking at security of Kubernetes clusters, a lot of these tools I actually found by just going to Artifact Hub, scrolling through the security section, researching things, and then discarding anything that wasn't useful and going more deeply into the things that looked useful for me. So I will now be taking questions as per usual. The folks at AWS and I are still talking to each other about a lot of these meetups. I've become part of the AWS Developer Acceleration Program. So if you do want to get in contact with AWS about things like Kubernetes, about the things that I've been discussing in this talk, then please feel free to use the QR code on the slides. There is also some speaker feedback there. So if you would fill that in, that will come back to me. And that is always really helpful for me in deciding what to do next.
Cool. Thanks, Don. That was a very interesting presentation again, as usual. So it's not surprising. Now, so far we've had a single question. So this is also a reminder to everybody. Ask your questions now while Don can answer them, because when she is not on screen anymore, it becomes harder to do so. But let's start with the first question from Prakash. Are there container images available that are secured by default?
As with all of these things, it depends on exactly what you want to do with them. A lot of container images that companies will produce for their default workloads will be secure by default. The use case for tools like Claire is more so if you're building your own workloads and deploying them to Kubernetes or to some other container orchestration application. You want to have something that's doing that scanning for you. You can also sometimes end up in really interesting situations where companies produce, images that you would think would be secure, and then you run them against a tool like Claire and you discover that they're not quite as secure as you thought they might have been. So it's going to be very situational. It very much depends on exactly what you're trying to do as to whether the images that you would be using will be secure by default. Having said that, though, if your main interest is in, how can I secure container images, a lot of those benchmarks that a lot of the tools, not just Claire, but SonarQube and other code scanning tools as well use, are published. So if you dig hard enough, you can actually go to them and you can find the underlying set of rules that they're using, which will allow you to do a sanity check on anything that you're producing before it finds its way either to Claire or onto your clusters or whatever else you're using for container orchestration.
That makes sense. I see another question has come in from Catherine. It's not the hardest one, but will the slide deck be available? Because she would love to have a list of the tools so she can try them out.
So the way that I usually do these sorts of things, and usually I would do it in advance, but time was not kind to me this past week. If you go to my GitHub page, I have a whole repository for all of the talks that I've done, and I publish links, and I will also publish all of the sources that I've used. So when that is online, I will make sure that it also appears on the Slack, and that will have links, because all of those tools that I've mentioned there are open source. So it will have links to the actual repositories, and for the tools that have Helm charts, it will also have links to the Helm charts.
Cool. That's always good. It might be useful if after you're done, you post a link to your GitHub in the chat as well.
Yeah, I will do that.
Yep, great. I don't see any other questions coming up. So,
I think I did vaguely see one when I looked about AWS Secrets Manager, and the answer to that is Secrets Manager and HashiCorp Vault are interchangeable for some things, but a lot of the default Kubernetes workloads that you would use would be more so things that would use KMS. Hence why KMS is things like mutual TLS, which is a lot of what's mentioned in the basics. That will tend to be stuff that's backed more by KMS than Secrets Manager. But Secrets Manager is really good for if you want to take secrets and integrate them into your workload, rather than just have some way to store encryption keys and certificates that you're using for mutual TLS.
Yep. Cool. Makes sense. I think that's it then. Nobody else has jumped up with a question. So I'm assuming that means everybody is now all up to date on obscure Kubernetes security. So, Dawn, thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Yep. It's always a pleasure. I think that then brings us to the next talk. I don't know if Rob wants to jump in or if we just get a... Yep. Cool. Then I'll hand it over back to you, Rob.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dawn. As always, your presentations have a great level of detail, and I really enjoy your presentation style. Always delightful and fun to watch and listen to. I look forward to seeing where your research takes you next time. And if you're out there and you're thinking about giving a presentation yourself, that's usually the best way to do it. When you go and start learning about a topic for the first time, having a presentation on the back of that is a great way to help push you to dive deeper. All right, it looks like Ian is ready with his slides. We won't go into too much of an introduction for Ian. You've probably heard him speak at least once a month for a little while now. So let me find the button for that. Here we go.
Cool. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm sure you haven't seen me for a long time, but right now I'll just be talking about AWS and batching and how to do as little work as possible. But before that, let's do the obligatory who am I? I work at Digio as a lead platform engineer, and through that, I am an AWS partner ambassador. I organized the Melbourne user group, as you are probably aware of, as well as DevOps Days in Melbourne, which will be coming later this year. So keep an eye out for that, I write on my site Ignore Me, and I do a couple of podcasts, most of which don't get updated very regularly, but I still do it. So now starting on the actual presentation, you may have a question, could I have picked a more boring topic? The answer to that is probably no. Well, I'm sure I could have picked something, but nobody likes dealing with patching. It's annoying, it's time consuming, and basically something that you don't really want to think about. Unfortunately, it's also something that is quite important. So why is it important? There's a couple of things. Obviously, there's the security angle, 0 days, bugs, whatever you want. And basically, whether it comes from you yourself or because of your security team, there will often be a reason to do a quick update. Most likely, some of you through your company got an update, got notified today that you need to update your Macs because there are some serious bugs in it, and the new OS version fixes that. So this kind of thing happens all the time, and therefore it's important. Then there's compatibility. Your things need to keep working. Sometimes you either have forced upgrades or So a good example of that, just keep working, is maybe you've used a tool or a script or something on an old machine somewhere at some point that called out to GitHub. And several years ago, they changed the minimum TLS version that could connect to it. And maybe your instance, your computer, or even container didn't have an up-to-date version of OpenSSL running, so it couldn't connect to that. That's the kind of thing I mean by compatibility. And of course, sometimes it is more on the feature side. Things get faster, they get better. This is not always a patching thing. So let me just be clear here. When I'm talking about patching, it's not necessarily the same as an upgrade. So an upgrade can be, I'm running MySQL 5.7 and I upgrade it to MySQL 8. Often there will be big changes there, and that is not necessarily what you want to do here. This is really about small changes just to make sure that things keep working or get slightly improved. Now, when it comes to patching and all these things, it's hard to not at least mention the shared responsibility model from AWS. So if you're not familiar with this, this is basically how AWS thinks about security. Everything on the bottom part is stuff that they take care of, and everything on the top is what we have to deal with. So this means that making sure that your instance runs is up to AWS. Making sure that it runs correctly with the right versions of the OS, with updated security patches, that everything is secure, that is up to us. So obviously, some parts of this are taken care of by AWS, and the rest, unfortunately, not. Now, important with this is that obviously the higher up the stack you go, the more a managed server something is, the less you will have to do. Does this mean you never have to deal with patching if you run serverless functions? Not quite. Unfortunately, if you haven't seen this page before, this is the lovely page from in the Lambda documentation about when something will stop working. Now, they won't actually tear down your Lambda functions if you're running one of these older versions, or one of these older runtimes, I should say. But what it does do is it will prevent you from updating. And unsurprisingly, that is not a great result. Now, as you can see here, that basically often means, especially if you're running Node, you will have to often update. Please keep in mind, this is not necessarily AWS's choice, but all of these projects, all of these runtimes here, they are no longer supported by the community that created them. And that is also why we constantly get new versions to play with. But it's not just with Lambda either. So we have to deal with all of the things, and some messages about this are nice. So it's recommended that you use a newer version of Node in your Beanstalk. Or as you can see earlier tonight, we have a new version of EKS or Kubernetes that is being supported by EKS. That means that an older version is now no longer available, or rather, it will stop being available, and AWS is kind enough to automatically upgrade you then to the next version. If you've ever done an upgrade with Kubernetes, you know that that does not necessarily go well. If it is just, from now on, we're running 1.17. Or even just with RDS. So there too, there's an end-of-life date approaching, and you have to upgrade it. It will either happen automatically. This one, luckily, would be a far less intrusive thing than with EKS, but still, all of these things happen, and you have to take care of them. So, but I was talking right here about how can we make this all easy. Now, luckily, for many of these managed services at least, it isn't hard. So yes, for your Lambda function, you just switch the version that you're running on. Or you pick a language like Go that doesn't get anything deprecated. But similarly then for RDS or Redshift or many of the other versions, they just allow you to automatically have AWS run upgrades in the background for minor versions. So this takes care of all the patching for you. Obviously, let me be clear and call out that if you do this for like RDS, make sure you've got at least your production system on multi-AC, because otherwise there might be some downtime. And while you can set when these kind of things happen, you don't want to have your main site go down even during the night. But obviously the managed services isn't the big thing when it comes to patching. Yes, there's some annoyances there, but let's be honest, the main thing that needs patching and that we all love to hate is the EC2 side of things. And here, another, I should have drawn a little B here, because pets and cattle, in a way, it's again a buzzword type thing. got your pets, which are your precious little servers that for one reason or another are considered important. They can't work in an auto-scaling group, and they generally run constantly. They may also be running very outdated software. And they still need the patching to happen. And then is your cattle, which is your auto-scaling groups. And these are usually short-lived instances. I say usually because it isn't always the case. There's plenty of times where an auto-scaling group can have instances that are a year or more old. It's generally not what they would be designed for, but it happens if you just have a very stable environment. Now, patching these traditionally is the wrong way. You SSH into them, or you use a slightly newer version of a slightly more modern way. You use Session Manager, or you RDP into them, or anything like that, and you do your clicky that makes life just so hard and annoying. And as somebody who has had to deal with this, it is a terrible experience, and I hope nobody actually has to do that anymore. Because obviously we want to automate everything. There's no fun in patching your instances. Say you have a cluster of 50 servers. Logging into them, you can automate some bits of it, but in the end, it's annoying. And yes, you can use tools like an Ansible or a Chef to do some patching. But again, that is something you would often have to start manually. Now, one service that AWS has that helps with this is the Systems Manager Patch Manager. As almost all services within Systems Manager, this is its own manager. And I really, really wish that at some point they changed that naming scheme. What Patch Manager allows you to do is set up automated patching, as well as immediate patching. I'll give a quick demo of this here. In here, I've set up 3 different types of servers. I've got an Amazon Linux 2 Graviton instance, a Windows instance, and an Amazon Linux 2 instance just running on Intel, old school. So this is 3 different types of instances with 3 different types of operating systems. And all of these are managed through this same patch manager interface. Now, if we want to just do a quick patch, we can click here on the Start Patching button. Then we can say, okay, just configure which patching do we want, the patch group, or we can select instances manually. Let's just do that to make it easy. This is something that is very important. We just want to make sure that everything gets patched immediately, because security is breathing down our necks. And that's always a good thing. Now, this is one of those lovely things here. Additional settings is a message. Awesome. But we do this. We just click the button and I actually clicked on the wrong button before. But it is doing patching now. If we look at the reporting, you'll see that it should be starting. Otherwise, we'll do a quick patch now, which is the button I should have clicked. And that's why things were a bit confusing. We've got reboot options. If needed, we can do a reboot. And then we just say, yep, do it all, store the logs, and patch now. It runs all the patching pretty quickly. And if we look at the instances, you can actually see what it has done. Mostly in the Fleet Manager section. Under patch, you can see what has it installed ever since, just in its history. And you can actually see that this is the same for the Windows machine, the Linux machines. They all run with the same command. You don't have to figure out, okay, what kind of machine is this? That doesn't mean you can't do that. So if we go back to here, you can set something up called patch groups. In this case, I created a special patch group for the Graviton instance. If you click at baseline, you can basically tell it, okay, I want to install all patches, or I only want to install security patches, anything like that. Actually, start creating a new baseline may show that the best. Basically, we can say here, this is for everything, and best. Let's say we want a special one for, yeah, not that one, for CentOS. And we always want CentOS to run these patches. After 3 days, patches will be automatically approved. Or the other thing that you can do is really only approve patches that were approved up to a specific, were released up to a specific date. So if your security team has some patches that have been approved, you can specify that way. We'll just want all, but we only want security patches. But security patches of any severity. You can even add exceptions, sources, and that was a create patch baseline. So then we have this baseline here. And what you can then do, then here, this is great. You can modify the patch group just over here under action. What this means is that you can assign it to a specific group of instances. This is instances that would have a tag with patch group test in this case. Say that, click OK, and then all the instances with that will have that. So one of the ones that, as I said, I did that for was the Graviton instances. And I set up a maintenance window for that as well. As I showed earlier, when you configure patching, you can set that up. So this is all intertwined, and I basically told it to patch my Graviton instance every 4 hours. So for the past day, it has been patching the instance every 4 hours. You can set this to any value you want. You can do it cron-based or rate-based. And it just depends on how important this is to you. So that's one way you can do all of this and get a pretty good and easy patch compliance. Another thing you can do, and I'm not going to demo that, is use Systems Manager automation. So Systems Manager automation allows you to write long, barely readable documents that do a lot of different steps. So this can involve things like download something, run a script, apply tags, anything you need to automate, you can do. One of the things that I've used this for in the past is in combination with scheduling from EventBridge, formerly CloudWatch Events, is anytime an EC2 instance changed from stopped or terminated, just went into the state of started, running, it would run an automation job. And this automation job would then apply any of the latest patches. So, for example, this could mean that if you have instances that only run once a month, you could apply these patches automatically. So you don't have to think about getting this sorted. You just have it done. You have it running in the background and all good. So this is how you would generally work with your pet servers. Now, it's also cattle. Basically, what you can see, what is used there in general is a combination of user data. Obviously, user data is something you can also do with your pets, but the problem with just doing an update in the user data is it only updates once. So if this means that your instance will be updated when it starts up, it will get all the latest security patches applied, and that's it. So it's not a great way of doing things unless you literally spin up your instances, new instances every hour, day, at a very high interval. But even then, if you're using old AMIs, this update starts taking a long time, which means that your instance isn't ready yet, or it will be insecure for a while all the patches are getting installed. The other option, obviously, is you can treat your autoscaling groups just like you do the pets. You set up your automation to automatically install patches. You can use Patch Manager to apply patches to all your instances on a regular basis. Or, things like that. And then, of course, there's your AMI rotation, where you basically just make sure that you always use the latest AMIs. So what do I mean by AMI rotation? It is really just let's run our AMI. Let's spin up your instance and use a new AMI. So in the autoscaling group, you could do rolling updates, things like that. Now, the easiest way to deal with that, to always automatically have your new AMI in use is if you use some of the AWS public parameters. So in the parameter store in Systems Manager, you now have an option to see all public parameters from AWS. And this includes and has included for a long time parameters that contain the latest values of their AMIs. So if you want the latest version of an Amazon Linux 2 instance, you can get the specific one for your region just by looking at the public parameter. Additionally, if you happen to use CloudFormation, you can provide a parameter like that you can use a parameter store parameter as a parameter in your CloudFormation template. So anytime you run it, it will automatically pull in the latest value and use that. If you don't use CloudFormation, you may need to build some other automation around it. But again, it's worth it to automatically have access to all these latest versions. Now, you can always go one step further, and that is just by making your own AMIs. The two most well-known ways in AWS land, I think at the moment for that, are Packer, which is the Dawn mentioned some HashiCorp product like Vault, and Packer is another one. It is a great product. It is, in my opinion, still the best way to bake your AMIs, but AWS has its own native image builder option, which is improving. I don't think it's good enough yet, but it's getting there. And then when at the end of your builds, you just update the parameter store object and share that with the accounts or inside the same account where you need it. And you can use it the same way as you use the public parameters from AWS. Now, if we go back to what is the best way for making sure that your kettle is always updated, I would almost say it's a combination of all of these, except probably the user data, because that part is only if you don't have your AMIs baked yet. So yes, bake your AMIs there, but if you need to quickly patch something, there is always Patch Manager to help you out. And I think with that, I have come to the end of my talk. So if there are any questions, I am happy to answer them.
Hey, Ian, thanks for that. We don't have any questions coming through at the moment. So this is a general reminder again that now is the greatest time for you to ask questions. While we've got Ian in this little box over here on the side, and he can be forced to answer them. I did have more of a curiosity thing or an opportunity for you to confess. How much do you treat your gear, especially your private gear, as pets versus cattle?
I try to go for anything that I run myself. I try to go as much as possible, just completely serverless.
Well, I guess that saves the issue, more or less.
Yeah. Because I hate
you're
patching.
such a advocate for containers and container-based deployments. Is that more of a day job thing, and you're really deep into serverless after hours?
Well, if I answered that question, then people will. I might ruin my reputation, and so
If only Chris was on here to probe further. But that's
Yep.
right. Doesn't look like we have any questions for tonight.
I probably bored everyone to sleep.
This is not your podcast. But there's an opportunity there for a podcast. If you'd like to hear more of Ian boring you to sleep, he does have a podcast devoted specifically for that. But no, it does actually cover some interesting topics, so go and check that out as well. Thank you very much, Ian.
Oh, nice, thank you.
All right, that is us again for another month. Thank you very much for joining in for May. We'll be back in June, obviously, potentially in person, depending on what happens tomorrow, I guess, what happens in the next few days with this current outbreak. Otherwise, we'll be back here, beamed live into your YouTube clients, wherever you might be. See where my slides are for this. So our next event is, as always, the last Wednesday of the month, which is the 30th of June this year. A big thanks again to our sponsors, Enabler, AC3, CMD, and Do It International for their support throughout 2020 and 2021. And to the virtual pub, there will be a Zoom link in Slack in just a few minutes when I actually go and create the event, because I forgot to do that. So we'll see you on Zoom if you want to stick around for a chat. Otherwise, we'll see you next month. Have a great rest of the week, and best of luck to us here in Melbourne. Thank you all.